Welcome, Michaela. It's great to have you here on our Leaders Who Care series.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
And I guess a shout out to our mutual good friend, Dr. Sarah McHugh, for introducing us. She's a force herself.
She certainly is. She's been a force since we first met. And we have a lot in common. Sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's negative, but it is forceful.
She did tell me the story how you first met, by the way.
Just because I had a pair on of leather pants, and we were both dealing with a very boring party or dinner, and we started talking. And she wanted to talk. She wanted to talk to me again and come, but I have a tendency to work with young people and say, look, this is what you can do to kind of improve your communication. And she at the time was still learning how to deal. She didn't understand that if you want to talk to the golfers who are the CEOs, you don't repeat, you don't talk, you don't gossip about, you have a different language when you're dealing with them and a different level of a sense of power. And that's something you have to learn to acquire.
Yeah, she also said you looked really hot in the leather pants, and that's another reason she picked you out.
I see, okay. Well, okay. Well, I mean, maybe hot, but I'm usually regarded as something has a few other different words, but that's okay.
No, I'm sure that wasn't the main reason, but she told me that anyway. So, hey, could you initially briefly introduce yourself, like where you're from, things like that, and then we'll talk more?
Sure. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. I started out at a French institute. I grew up in a Catholic family. There were 5 of us. I was the middle child, and I was the one that didn't get along with anybody. Everybody else was just getting along with everybody except me. But I had a different view of the world. I was curious. I built gardens. I just, I always had ideas. I liked attention. And my mother was somebody who just wanted everybody to love her. So she didn't challenge. I mean, I was always challenging. And so I was also regarded as being difficult and problematic. And as I grew up, my recognition was I was the troublemaker. But anyway, and I went to many different schools because no one knew how to deal with me. I mean, they tried sewing, they tried everything. And I just was curious. So that was how I went. And I was the last to leave home. I had a pretty successful group of siblings. There were 4 girls and 1 boy, and I was the middle child. Black hair, black sheep, as they call them in Irish families. And nobody else loved to go out to the country to my grandparents. I loved to go out and go into the woods and follow the stream and get poison ivy and impetigo from picking wild strawberries and blueberries, etc. And I remember I've always loved trees. That was always a big part of my interest in nature. But and I wanted to go east to school. I wanted to go to Smith when I got out of high school. But I was told that I had to go to a Catholic school in the East. And I had 2 aunts who had been, one of them was head of the Loretta Heights College in Denver, Colorado. And and she had gone to Manhattanville College. So I ended up going to Manhattanville, but for 1 year. And I loved being close to New York. And I wasn't a great student, but my father became quite ill, so I had to drop out of school because there was no money to pay for it. So I went to work in Kansas City and ended up going to work for the first Merrill Lynch office that was opened outside of New York, in a small office in Kansas City, just as a secretary. I mean, I knew how to do, I knew how to do shorthand. I knew how to work I had done. I'd worked on summers and things. And at the end of 3 years, I said, I'm going back to New York. I want to go into the world of fashion. And the boss said, well, look, why don't we just transfer you and at least you'll have a job uh, when you get to New York so that you'll be able to pay for your room and board until you decide what you're going to do.
Hmm.
So off I went. And I went down to Merrill Lynch downtown, 10 Pine Street. Turned out to be that's where my grandfather's office had been when they built 10 Pine Street on 1932. His offices were still there. So that was kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah.
Um, when I walked into personnel, they were at the time struggling with trying to fill a new office in New York called Merrill Lynch International. And personnel knew nothing about international. So of course they didn't have friends from one department in New York that they could send over to the other one. So here was like a golden opportunity for them. Here I was the stranger who knew the system. We'll just send her right down to this new foreign department. Okay. So all I went, nobody knew what a golden opportunity it was for me. I walked into something that just I had never experienced. And I met all these very handsome people who flew in from New York from Florida, from Europe and Asia and all this. And these men love to take you out at night, dinner and dancing. So they try to pick you for brains. So for 3 years, I worked very, very hard. I went to night school because there wasn't anything for women in the training program, and studied and got registered so that I could enter orders into the New York Stock Exchange. In those days, the New York Stock Exchange, the trading market was 300,000 shares compared to what we have now electronically. Anyway, to shorten it up, in 3 years, there was news that they were going to open an office in Beirut, Lebanon, and people from the training department were going to go over. Why don't you come too? And you could help train personnel. Everybody was nervous going to Beirut, Lebanon. I didn't even know where it was on the map. I had to go get a book and look it up on the. So I went down to the personnel and I said that I had this opportunity to go to Beirut, Lebanon, and they said, oh, it's way too dangerous for us to send women overseas. We couldn't possibly approve that. Okay, so I went back up. I quit my job, Merrill Lynch domestic, paid my own way to Beirut, Lebanon, and was hired by Merrill Lynch International. And that's when it began. I ended up staying 5 years. I had the time of my life. I shared a beautiful apartment with a view of the mountains and a view of the sea in Beirut. And I played as well as worked hard with people from all over the world. And in those days, there were events for presidents and ambassadors, but nothing for staffing. They were just beginning to have international staffs in the embassies and in companies. And so we formed an organization called Foreign International Group. I met a woman from from the United States, who had been hired by a newspaper in Beirut, who was older, so she wouldn't be chased by. And I became kind of a legend. People say, who is this woman who's a member of the New York Stock Exchange? She's not being kept by some sheikh, and I didn't dance at the Kit Kat Club. So, but I did work very, very hard, and I stayed 5 years. And I'd never seen men look at women in the same way that they looked at them all over Beirut. Anyway, it was a wonderful education, but it taught me to be my own person. Mm-hmm. And it taught me to think about what it was made me who I was and how I thought about things. And I no longer thought of myself as a troublemaker. I was very creative. I worked very hard, and I was trusted. So when I got ready to come home, I thought, I don't want to be an expat. They sent me to London to then train personnel, as the Bank of England was going to allow the English to bring their money back into England without having to pay a 13% charge. Mm-hmm. And so I trained people about how to open up a bank account at Merrill Lynch and become international. This was, as I describe it now, this was when the global economy that the United States was encouraging was rising. And now we're down on the downside. It's all kind of changing. We have new technology. We have people becoming more nationalists rather than internationalists. It's a changed world. So I've ridden it both ways. And when so I came back to the United States and wanted to go into sales because that's where the money was. It was just like wanting to go into lending at a bank. That was where the money was, because you got paid commissions. Oh no, we don't have any women in sales.
Right.
So my former boss, who I'd had when I was in New York before, said, Michaela, changes are taking place on the street. There's so many new institutions and ideas, people. Why don't you go out and look? Well, it broke my heart to think after 10 years I had to leave Merrill Lynch, but I went out and I was immediately hired by the people who had the second venture hedge fund, City Associates. And I went to work for them, and 2 years later, people from Denver hired me to run an office for them because their partner was going to trade the first mutual fund that was to be traded on the New York Stock Exchange. So talk about having to learn new experiences. And then a year later, I was made a partner of the firm. And I went to Beirut at 27, and this was 37. I was made a partner of a firm, and the young partners started acting up against me. I don't need to go into details about that, but the older ones were thrilled to have a woman partner, and the other ones. So you're shaking your head, so I know you understand what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
And then I was asked to do a couple of things as a partner that legally were okay, but morally for me, I found it very, very difficult. So the first one I kind of let go and I did it and I agreed and all this. Second time, I thought, I can't do this. And if I stay on Wall Street, I can make a lot more money. If I leave, I'll just have to go. I don't know what I'll do. Anyway, I did leave. I did not want to move to Denver, Colorado, or back to Kansas City. And so I left, and I spent the summer at the beach. And then I had been doing drug education, helping teenagers change the way they could pass their equivalency exams to get out of high school, so they could go on to finish their degree from high school. And I used to do that on the Lower East Side when I get off work. And before that, I had joined the Junior League, and we put out a book talking about the new problems about drugs with kids in high school. And so we put out a book showing where there was assistance. And this was for nothing more than the PTAs and the professors, because a couple of friends of mine had kids who were in high school and they were lost from doing drugs with no training. It was all a whole new ball game.
Right.
So I did that, and so then I was hired. I left, and some people who I had worked with called me and said, there's a foundation that is looking for a woman. Would you be interested in talking to them? I knew nothing about foundations. So I went to have lunch with them in the Rainbow Room at Rockefeller Center for lunch. These two guys, they didn't know how to talk to me, but anyway, it was okay. But they would be very, very, very good friends. So anyway, to shorten the story, I went to work for on a part-time basis to help move some of the money that was managed by family in a building and in an environment that they owned and controlled. And so they had to move some of their accounts out. So I helped manage the foundation, the transfer of people. And then the guy I first started working for, very creative, and I didn't exactly see eye to eye. He was looking more for a pair of hands than he was for somebody who wanted to think up new ideas.
Right.
So I had an interview with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and I was hired by them. And to this day, the president of that foundation at the time, William Deedle, is still a very, very dear friend. I have huge admiration for him. But he had been a teacher, and I think he understood that a lot of the things that I talked about were something you just needed to let her explain it better and get deeper. And he really was he was like a consultant for me, or an advisor or something, besides I was working for him.
Right.
And people used to laugh, and I just did all the garbage that the family wanted done. It wasn't a specific program under the foundation. But that led to him coming to me and saying there's going to be a meeting in Mexico City by the United Nations, and there's a non-governmental organization being organized for about the subject of women, and I think you should probably go to that. Well, I knew nothing about international development, but I knew a lot about banking, international, and how international banking worked. So off I went. I knew I'd never been to Mexico. Well, it changed my life, and I have never looked back. Came for 8,000 women coming together from every country in the world, talking about poverty, and there were no one there from Wall Street. It was all international development. And so I really learned, and then somebody said, Michaela, there's a lot of talk about wanting to set up a credit program for women.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be willing to meet them? So I had dinner with two women, and I was absolutely blown away by their passion and their commitment for development and what they were saying about the role of women at the grassroots. And so I agreed to help them. And they said they wanted to start some kind of a fund for credit for women. Well, to them, it was nothing but government money put into a fund for them that they could turn around and use as an NGO to make out, instead of a grant, they would call it a loan. They knew nothing. There was no unity between Wall Street and banking world and government in those days, as we all know. Yep. So when I went back, the boss says, "Oh, sure, you can spend some time with them." And so it was basically weekends and nights. And we started there were a group of about 5 of us, and we spent 4 years talking to everybody we could talk to about the idea of setting up some kind of a bank for women. And I was sent down to Millbank Tweed by the lawyer who worked with us. And there was a Dutch young man there who was talking about teaching lawyers in the United States about global, how do you take tax exemptions for global investments on a global basis. Leave it to the Dutch. They're just always so far ahead of everybody else anyway. So I went back a few months later, I went to Europe with Hazel Henderson to a Club of Rome meeting in Rome, but I took a detour and I went to Holland and went to this office, to this law firm, made an appointment, and I met this man who got what I was talking about. But he thought we were just going to have a regular bank. I said, no, it's financial services to help women get bank accounts, because up to those point, they couldn't even have savings accounts without male signatures.
I know.
And so out of that meeting in Mexico, we learned, how do we get production for women and reproduction, and so that women could own their own things. Anyway, so that led to one thing. And pretty soon we learned that Holland had set up a new Triodos Bank, which allowed the bank to put their deposits into environmental issues. So it was a whole new concept. So pretty soon we got this approval for setting up something that was a nonprofit, but it was approved by the bank. And it had kind of this long international name. So prior to that, Brad Morris had left Congress from Massachusetts and had become head of UNDP at the UN. Mm-hmm. And the UNDP was head of, everyone said, oh, you can't give money to this women's group without formal approval of everybody, all 100 companies, I mean, that's, ambassadors. Well, I knew that a man who had been in business and then in the Congress and then under this thing wasn't doing what he's doing without access to something.
Right.
So I just knew that, everywhere I've ever gone, I've always learned something. And so I did know that. And so then he said, well, what if we gave you, I don't know whether it was 25,000 or 200,000 or whatever, something, and to hold meetings in 5 regions of the world to find out if this idea of a banking accounts for women was doable. I said, I'll take it. And all these women were just saying, oh, you can't do that. And somebody said, where are you going to get the money to do that? He said, well, what would you do with it? And I said, I guarantee you that I can prove to you that this is something that women need and it can be used effectively.
Sure.
So sure enough, then they wanted to have the first meeting in Africa because of the work and development. I said, look, we already have an account, an approval. Let's do it in Holland. So there were 50 of us, and we each one knew 3 people from different countries. But I had one day, I was sitting I did a program from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund with Office of Technology Assessment in Washington to really look at the idea of modern technologies and how would they be used. I was a disaster, but anyway, close to real power, I'm a disaster. Put me on the edge, I can be effective. So anyway, I went to, I lost my train of thought here for a minute. But I said, so I called and said, we'll have these meetings. But we're going to have the first one in Holland. Mm-hmm. Somebody said, Michaela, you can't do that. You can't afford it. He's going to pay for it. So we put the word out. And then I get a phone call at OTA from a guy who worked with Brad Morris, Tim Rothermill. And he says, I'm Mr. Rothermill from the UN. And he said, I understand you're having a meeting in Holland. I said, yes, we're an independent organization and we're having a meeting in Holland to bring people together about how we might do something about credit for women. And he said, well, there's a king from Africa that wants to send observers. And I said, I appreciate that very much, Mr. Rothermill. But I said, if we had all of the invitations for observers who came to that meeting, there would be more than people who really were interested in and really understood what they were talking about. And he said, yes, but he says, we've made a contribution. I don't know where it came from, but I said, yes, I understand that. But I said, we're an independent organization. And if you would like me to return the money to you, I would be happy to do that. And I don't know where it came from in my brain. I have no idea. It was just one of those instincts. He says, oh, no, we wouldn't do that. Well, I learned that technocrats and bureaucrats will always extend their power base until you challenge them. Then they back away. Another lesson learned.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So the meeting turned out to be just sensational. And we danced and we laughed. None of us knew each other. None of us ever knew any more than 3 people. But there were some wonderful people there. It was just incredible. And we all agreed that 2 years later we'd have another one, but we had one speaker. In 2 years later, we had one speaker that a young man from Acción in Boston told us about a woman and a project down in Cali, Colombia. And she was invited to come and talk about how women who were in banking in Colombia would put up money for a guarantee so that women had assets, because money would go to men because they owned all the assets. Women owned none of them. Mm-hmm. So there was another twist in the story. So she came. Well, within another 2 years after that, there were 10 of these things that had been set up. And in each country, we would say, look, we don't know how to do business in your country. You tell us what you need and we'll help you do it. But you had to, in order to be independent, because I knew that if you were private or independent, you could get money discounted from the central bank. for lending purposes. Now, the government people, the UN people knew nothing about that. So I think all the way along in my creation of Women's World Banking, which I have said all along, could never have done it alone. I was, when we were planning this, all the other people were independent. I mean, were from UN and government. And I was the only one who knew nothing about development banking. I knew, or finance, and knew nothing about the UN, but it was an education for me. And I think
an education for them too.
Absolutely. So it was the diversity of willing to work towards something that you don't really know or understand, you can learn. But out of that, we said everybody had to find, within your own country, you had to find $20,000. I knew that was not a problem. All the people who were interested were all rich women. They could, and I said, and they had to have a legal structure to be a financing institution, not a bank, just a financing institution. Mm-hmm. Those were two simple things that I knew they could do. And within 2 years, we had 10. And then it went on. So but then many of them thought, oh, it's just a free ride, you know. So that's how it started. And the first bank, one of the first people that we met was Mary Okello from Kenya. And she was the first African woman to be made a manager of Barclays Bank. Wow. In Nairobi. At a time when there were not even toilets for women. Yeah. And none of them had the banks had no working hours for women. You know, women, most of the women ran the work on the farms, and they had no access to banks. So 2 years after that it was a first $100 loan to a woman who'd never had a bank account before. She got a bank account, and the women could make a savings for their children, but the men signed also. So suddenly, 2 years later, when we started checking out this loan, we discovered that Barclays had 5 guarantees against one was our guarantee, 2 from England, from the major. It was a joke, you know. But anyway, it had started.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but everyone could copy, and so that's how it began. And then I started. Somebody in the Dutch bank said, "Oh, you can't have a banking institution for in Holland under Dutch law." So they finally changed it, and we called it, instead of an international bank for women, we called it Women's World Banking, ING, for banking services and finance. Well, pretty soon everybody started copying the same brochure that we put out, and it just evolved. And everybody would come together every 2 years, and everybody approved or disapproved all the policies. It was totally diverse. And we tried to get a visa so that we could bring in an international staff, but we couldn't do that. So that didn't work. And we had an office, and I finally took on the role. They wanted me to take the job on for $25,000 a year. I mean, which is what most nonprofit. I said, I can't do that. I can't support myself. So it went to 75. I mean, 80. I think 60. That was a big issue.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So it's interesting. So that's how Women's World Banking came about, right? And I find it super interesting. Like you said, I didn't know anything about this, didn't know anything about that. In some ways, that was an advantage for you, because then you would just do it.
But what I have learned out about that is that as difficult as my life as a child growing up, and as difficult as my relationship was with my mother, she taught me how to defend myself. So that when I started having to defend my staff against the staff at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, who all laughed about what I was trying to do, if that was an important thing to do, men would have done it from the World Bank, of course. Men would do it, of course. And then also that I was, the bankers said, this is crazy. We don't need these women. All of a sudden, they were opening up banking, and these banks were working. People did pay back their loans.
Hmm.
So, so I learned how to deal with governments and bankers.
And you really, I'm sure you've heard this before, you really pioneered what we're still talking about of having women have the, equal opportunity and freedom and the ability to be creative. I mean, normal basic human, rights basically, but you really pioneered when certainly you had, I would think, a number of people that were against it because they would lose control or something.
About 98% of them.
Yeah, approximately.
You know, you know. And then, but also, there are things that you can learn out of that we can learn out of that. For instance, I left Wall Street for the same reason that now there are legal reasons for that have been laws have been set up to prevent some of the things that happened to me. But secondly, the politics against, and it's not against just against women, it's power that we're talking about. And I think people need to stop playing games about that and face up to it. It is power that we're talking about. You don't see women on the very few women on the golf course from the top ranks of the banks. The banks still are controlled by men and only a few men. This is this is real change in the world. And then as there have only been 3 presidents of Women's World Banking in 45 years, which says something about the collaboration that women can create. And but as the world changed, I began to understand that it's not going to survive if it remains only a nonprofit institution. And so when we started looking for the third person, I also voted for Mary Ellen, who's now the president and has been. It's now a totally research financial institution. Doesn't have the same mission that I had, but after 45 years, it's still there. It's still well known. It's still around the world, and it's still respected for its integrity, for the respect for the grassroots.
No,
So,
what an achievement, and what an impact on the world, especially obviously for women, and and it's always surprising, we consider ourselves modern. It's always surprising how not modern and how not open we are to
right.
women.
No
And even,
question. No question. We still, and my own sense of this is that I have never wanted to be a superstar. I've always played below the radar screen. And I'm always kind of amazed when somebody calls and says, "Can I talk to you about?" Because I didn't have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, strategy. I tried to listen to what the need was. And my grandfather had been a very strong political voice at the turn of the 20th century, and had very little PR about it, but he was a very strong political voice for saying that in order for democracy to survive, people have to make money and they have to spend money. You can't hoard money. And I think that's one of the reasons that we've been in trouble, is that we narrow down the value into too few hands. And I think now we're seeing some change. I feel a sense of change. This next younger generation are beginning to understand politics, and I pray that they will learn to understand the integrity of needing to be an honest politician and an honest banker. And now I worried about them for a long time about their research. Now I think they're doing fabulous work with research, and I think that when I listen to some of the corporations talk about the fact that the young people are telling the bosses of things that they think why are we doing it this way? Why aren't we doing it this way? And all. And I think people are beginning to listen to each other now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Part of what we do is a lot of companies, organizations retain us to find the best talent for them. That's part of what we do. we also help our clients align all their capital with impact. And what we found is, women, and you can never generalize, but women have an innate ability, if you will, to collaborate more, to listen more, to get things done, and not so much of the BS, not so much of the power, but to get things done.
Well, it's nice to hear a man say that, because it used to be that they would say, "Oh, women don't know what they're talking about."
Of course,
Yeah. But they're much more open about sharing information and collaborating. They trust it more. It's not. I don't think that it's that it. I think that we are in. I think people are beginning to understand that basically our training has made us different.
Right, absolutely. And I think if you combine that with the young women and even young people, and
Young men.
they definitely are, yes, and they definitely are looking at, we trademark the term leaders who care for a reason, because we believe, and this is what young people are doing, and especially women, is that you can have an economic and social impact at the same time. In other words, you can have integrity and be positive about making a change, which is about making money, but not just about making money, making an impact on the world.
The other strong value system that I've kind of carried through this, that I think is increasingly maybe beginning to come to light, that people used to tell me I didn't know what I was talking about, is the fact that I do believe, knowing how, particularly what African women taught me about local economies, that if we don't keep diversity in the distribution of resources, whether it's food or so, I see small business beginning to maybe find a way back into having an impact. It will take a while, but I mean, if I go up on the roof of my building and I look down on some of the others, people have little farms up on the
That
roof.
was just exactly.
I mean, it's really quite. It's quite. They have the French garden style. They're in pots and stuff like that. They're above the roof, but I mean the whatever, the grass, whatever it is on the roof. But they're growing food, and now you have these electric lights where you can grow
Absolutely.
lettuce and vegetables and fruits in your house. I'm thinking about having one of those maybe. But anyway.
It's interesting you say that, because that goes back to the point of, you can have economic and social impact at the same time. We can grow our own food. There's community feeling that happens from that as well. It all comes together.
And the community gardens that are working and fighting against the city that wants to eliminate them. We're in a big fight here right now about trying to preserve a lot of the neighborhood atmosphere around the Penn Station,
Right.
because real estate just want great big high buildings that are getting uglier and uglier by the year, because they want them up faster and faster and cheaper,
Mm-hmm.
and they think it's going to create big rent. Most of ours have big empty holes in their rentals right now. So anyway, I'm hoping that maybe that's going to delay some of that for a while, but it's an ever evolving story.
It is, and you put a big positive dent in it, which is, thank God for that. So we can move forward on it. I want to ask you two more things in this part.
Okay.
My grandfather, my grandparents, my mom were from Kyiv, way back in Ukraine, and I grew up in Montreal with them, and they would always say with an accent, "As long as you have your health, that's the most important thing." And it wasn't a slogan. It was from real life experience. What's important with all the things that have been happening with the pandemic, with racial social justice, with you name it. Mother Nature is not a happy camper. She's trying to send us a message here. Do you think that there's been, lack of a better word, an awakening of what's important?
Certainly among the younger generation. We're always going to have the diversity, the extreme people who are afraid of change and who want to keep it like it was, and people who think they can run away from the realities of success. for an entrepreneur, there is no such thing as failure.
Right.
You can you can have good lessons and learn lessons, but it's not failure. So I think that if we can, I think one of the important things for the culture as a whole to do right now, to answer your question, is to change a lot of the language or the words that we use, because they all have so multi meanings and shaded colors about the meaning of certain words, even though they mean the same thing. But I think that there's a much greater sensitivity of realizing that health is very important. Health is, and that you can take a lot of responsibility yourself by just movement.
Mm-hmm.
Which before you had to go to the doctor, the expert, who was going to tell you what was wrong.
Right.
You never thought about asking. Well, now, I mean, even the physical therapists now have to have certain medical degrees in order to be able to do physical therapy. And I have learned a lot about my own health and my own physical well-being because I had to have some physical therapy for a problem that I had. And at 89, I can still walk 15,000 steps a day if I need to.
Love it.
So I'm kind of nuts. I'm known as a kind of a eccentric, whatever, but I can still function.
Positive. I think eccentric is positive.
Huh?
I think eccentric is a super positive term. And
well, I think you have to be positive, and if health leads to the food you eat and how much money you have to buy good food, what the prices of all those things are. And so this, and I think about the politics of what creates the political environment of red and blue and what's been going on in Washington. I think people are beginning to understand we have to go back to collaborate. This week has been a good example for me in terms of what's going on in Washington. And I pray and hope. And so I just think that there's.
So that was what you're saying there is my last question here. I'd love to ask you. In 2021, one of my clients said to me, he said, the year 2020, it just flew by slowly. And I thought that was a brilliant statement. And so here we are already almost the end of 2022. Can you share what you're most grateful for and maybe also what you're most hopeful for?
I think I'm most grateful for the fact that I can still function. I have lost a lot of friends. I have lost my older brother, and my older sister. And it is, and I have a sister who's moving away from here to Florida. And I'm so sad that she's moving, but I'm so happy that it's making her happy.
Right.
And that's a change, it's not my decision. And I think we all need to understand better how to understand where somebody else is coming from. And I think so in terms of being grateful, I have learned a lot of that in the pandemic by just the reflection and quietness, slowing down. And yet I'm still a happy person. And as of yesterday, after spending 1 year of going through my Walsh Library collection, 1,200 books have been packed up in boxes, recorded, and have been shipped out by a wonderful man who was able to pick every single one of them, the boxes up, and put 17 boxes, put them in his car and drive them down to Villanova University to a new institute for women's leadership.
Wow, that's great.
And they're going to have their own collection to be able to use for their own. And I go back to the environmental movement, the appropriate technology movement, when solar and people, this was 25, 40 years ago, when young people were talking about this and people would say they're crazy.
Right.
Bad science, they would say.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thrilled that it's been saved and it'll be used. It's not going to be just thrown out or put on on the street to be sold for $1. Somebody will read it and throw it. I'm thrilled. There's a collection there of a woman who cared a lot about most people and making the society a better place for most people. All I cared about was making sure that particularly women had an easier life in terms of doing what they want to do than I did. I have worked hard. I don't want to work so hard anymore. I'll tell you that much.
I don't blame you.
I want to play. I want to play and I want to laugh.
Well,
you know?
laughter, when you talk about health, laughter is a big part of that. So
I didn't have enough of it, and I'm going to have more now. If I don't know how long it's going to last, but I am going to laugh.
I'll send you a joke a week. How's that?
Oh, please do.
All right, you got a deal. Hey, I'm so thrilled to get a chance to meet you and hear that story, and thanks for being a leader who cares. Way before I think a lot of people were talking bad science, as you said, and super appreciative of you being here. And hey, let's do it again in another 5 years, and then 10 years, and so on.
All right, can I just say one more thing?
You bet.
I have to challenge you about what you mean by leader. And I think we need to define what we mean by leader. I've never considered myself a leader. The book that I wrote, Founding a Movement, is talking about everybody who participated, because Women's World Banking could never have happened by just one person. It was tons of people, and I just kind of drove the bus. So I think we need to think about what we mean by the word leader. We don't need this anymore. That came out of FDR in the Second World War, and the veterans who got to go to school.
It's a great point. And where we talk about leaders who care is they care about their talent, they care about their people, etc.
I like that, leaders who care. That's really good. And that's why I brought it up as a final note, because I think that's I think that's what we should define ourselves, leaders who care.
We do need to care more. We do need to be kind. That's for sure.
Got it.
So thank you for being one, and so kind for welcoming me into your
and
home.
And our love to Sarah for connecting us.
We love you, Sarah. There's no doubt.
Okay.
Thanks.